Take Back, friends. This is part 2 of our rewatch of the Radical reading series. Please check these out, share them. We got plenty more. Go through the YouTube archives to find many more of these, more coming in 2025. Subscribe at patreon.com/leftreckon to get the rest of them. No more chit chat. Let's go. Radical reading series starting now.
Just to set it up really quick, we have to think about what this next year is going to mean for the socialist movement in this country. And I think the biggest question that we all need to be considering is how to build a stronger movement going into this next year. And what's in front of us? It's going to be a fight, as always, for labor and for democracy and against empire. How can we embolden that fight is the big question, right? And everyone says, oh, we got to return to labor. Oh, we got to return to doing mass politics. Oh, we got to grow, all this kind of stuff. Like really thinking about what that means, I think is important. And you can do that by looking a little bit backwards at what the Biden administration has meant for the socialist movement, right? There have been significant victories, particularly on the local and state level, as more members of the DSA have been elected on city and state level offices. That has massive promise for the future of this movement. The embeddedness in the labor movement, too, I think has been one of the most exciting and important things. Remember, like not only these big wins for the UAW, these big wins for the Teamsters, but I think a narrative that has been missed is how much of a role DSA members have played within that. I'm not trying to say to take credit or anything like that, but there are people who are in positions of influence, power, volunteer positions who have been out there showing up, participating in these movements. That's real. That's the kind of rootedness in the class struggle that we need. And of course, you couldn't ignore the movements against the slaughter in Gaza, right? These massive street movements and the public education that we've seen, right? So we've seen a lot of successes, right? But this has also been a period of fragmentation and disappointment. The Bernie movement is over in the sense of, being able to coalesce around a grand presidential campaign at that scale and promise. Add in the frustration with many of the symbolic leaders of this movement. We're talking about the Squad. We're talking about influential media figures. The space between supporters of these movements and the leaders itself has been shown. And I think that has created a lot of frustration. And that has led us into a strategic and I think theoretical crisis in our movement. And the question is, what lessons should we learn from this period and how to reorient? And there's been this fragmentation, particularly around this question, right? That has a full spectrum all the way from everything that has happened since 2015 has been a big scam, and people were trying to bamboozle and derail and destroy the movement. That's one camp. To another camp that sort of says, hey, this is the slow march of progress. We should continue doing what we were doing without. I think the truth of that sort of lands somewhere more in the middle. But we're seeing this fragmentation, I think, really expand. And I think going into 2024, the task ahead of us has to be finding a way to revive that spirit of mass politics, doing politics at the national scale, building and growing and articulating for a better future. But also, while we're doing that, not let the immediate goals of our movement allow us to get sloppy about articulating the heart of our critique. That all these fights that we are engaged in will ultimately be unsuccessful until we can weaken the power of the capitalist class, the power of the working class. This brought me to a piece that we'll read a little bit from Eugene Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party, who is the most successful socialist on a general presidential ballot ever. And he wrote this piece around the time when he was running for president, from prison. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger, but also just important to note that this was written when Eugene Debs was imprisoned and running for the president of the United States. So the piece is called Why Are We Not Stronger? And he says, one reason, and in my opinion, a very real one, why we have not better succeeded in organizing the workers is to be found in our intolerant attitude and ill-tempered spirit towards those of our own class and our own ultimate aim who differ from us. Socialists, communists, anarchists, syndicalists, and wobblies spend more time and energy fighting each other than they do fighting capitalism. Each faction assumes that it is entirely right and that all others are entirely wrong, a very human way of seeing things, but far better calculated to prevent than to promote the effectiveness of organization of the workers. This next one here, there are, of course, and of necessary differences, a necessity of differences between these various groups of organized workers, and these differences are wholesome, result in clear understanding, corresponding unity and solidarity, provided they are met in the right spirit and are made the means of promoting intelligent discussion and acquiring more truth and greater knowledge, thereby building and adding up new strength to the organization. And he goes on to sort of articulate why is it that we can't have debates and conversations and political differences within our own movement without it falling in to bitter infighting. And he says up next, personally, I have equal respect for all who stand foursquare for the working class and for the overthrow of the capitalist system, whether they be socialists, communists, anarchists, or the Wobblies. I don't find it necessary to hate and denounce them because their method differs from mine. They may be right. I don't think they are, but I have been mistaken a good many times in the past, and I'm just as apt to be so now as anyone else. This last bit here, I think, really gets to what we're talking about here. So I read this in a communist paper. The first thing we must do is smash the Socialist Party. The writer of that sentiment will find ready allies in Wall Street, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Manufacturers Association, and I'm inclined to think they would pay a round price for the job. More than likely, this comrade, who now calls himself a communist, once belonged to the Socialist Party. Now he wants to smash it. His former comrades are either crooks or fools, and he must now devote his time to smashing their party. He then adds, we know that the Socialist Party is not all that it should be, but instead of deserting it, we are going to do our best to make it a clean, virile, uncompromising revolutionary party of the workers in their worldwide struggle for industrial freedom. I've been reading another communist comrade who sneers with scorn at persons from whom and the places from where he got his first lessons in socialism. They seem to appear utterly contemptible in his eyes since he has scaled the peaks of science and now sees it all with clear eye and an outstanding heart. I confess I cannot understand that feeling. I have not only a deep sense of gratitude, but a sort of reverence for those who gave me the least help or encouragement in finding my way into the socialist movement. And there shall never be in my heart or upon my lips a sneer for one of them, however far the movement may have left them behind. And he ends here by saying something, and I think this is maybe the energy we should take into this next year of struggle. I hope we have a more decent, tolerant, and truly revolutionary spirit in our attitude toward those whom we differ in the movement, and that we may devote our whole time and energy in organizing the workers into one industrial union and one political party for the gigantic struggle which confronts them and which they must win or remain in slavery. The most effective answer to those who sneer at political action is with silence when argument fails. Let them alone and stick to your work of education and organization. And, I highly suggest people read the whole piece, Why We Are Not Stronger by Eugene Debs. Remember, he wrote this when he was imprisoned by the state for opposing World War I, American involvement in World War I. Eugene Debs was not somebody that you could call a reformist, but he was seeing, I think, very similar things to what we are seeing today. Things that I think are almost worse because at least then people were members of organizations who might have been fighting with one another versus now where a lot of times when people say, oh, I'm a communist or an anarchist or a socialist or whatever, what that means is a kind of personal, spiritual, social identification rather than as a member of an actual organized and activated a block of working people. But I mean, I think that we've been seeing this for years since we've been on the left, right, Matt? This kind of capacity to wage war stronger with those close to you than our enemies. And I want to throw to you to hear your thoughts on this. But I will say, none of this is a call to not have those fights, to not have those debates. Those are really, really important. But it's actually having a capacity and ability to work in a comradely way with one another. So that we can build a strong working class movement and learn from one another when, maybe, a certain perspective or tendencies. Strategy is wrong in a moment, or at least you can articulate yours better with engaging in that. And I think that that's something that's really fallen to the wayside, especially as I think, as Eugene Debs puts really well there, all those people in his time who were members of the Socialist Party, who left the Socialist Party and joined other ones, deciding that, all these things that sort of cultivated me and, I grew with, are now my number one enemies. I think you could see that a lot with people who are very gung-ho for Bernie Sanders 2016, 2020, who are now super based online communists who have no place for anyone else.
Yeah. Well, I also one thing, this goes with my favorite line of thought, which is to not pathologize or over catastrophize things, because this is things that, if people watched my viewing of the Prairie Trilogy documentary series of the North Dakota Socialists, Henry Martinson talked about this and how they had to come to the defense of the Wobblies, who were getting arrested for actually, doing in-person civil disobedience in Minot, North Dakota. And despite, not agreeing with the Wobblies' approach, which he thought was a little bit alienating, in certain respects, like, they felt the need to show solidarity with them because what they're doing was fundamentally for the workers. And I just think, like, these are, I don't think people should get into the line of like, oh, the left sucks and look at the left doing this wrong. These are things, these are waters that we have to navigate and have always had to be navigated. It's the difficulty of dealing with, different people in like a large scale. But I love Debs' approach, because that's how I feel. I'm a DSA member, but when people like call in and say I'm PSL or I'm a different, like, I take the approach of like any of those. Like, honestly, like, people say like, and people make things so much about voting. It's like, say, I don't want to vote. It's like, well, okay, that's good. Are you a member of like a communist party or something like that? Or is it just online that you express yourself? I think, like, as long as people are doing the work like this, I think that you should be open to, and also extend charity and sympathy and like a little bit of humility towards people. Folks, welcome patrons to Left to Reckoning. I'm Matt Leck, with me as ever, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Sorry about your World Cup disappointment.
It's okay.
There's always next year.
I'm used to, the only thing that was a bummer about is like, it's every 4 years,
Yeah.
And like, I don't know, this is probably just like me freaking out about age and stuff, realizing that like the next crack at it, I'm gonna be 34. Like, very clearly on the other side of like, oh, I'm not getting called up anymore to come and save the day is a harrowing thought, but it'll be here, which will be fun.
As someone who turns 34 tomorrow, that is really what these last 4 years are about, is like, oh yeah, it's over for that. All these guys, like, it's not just that, like, because right now you're basically in your athletic prime, so your cohort is all like, like in the prime of their careers. My guys are like, breaking down, like Kevin Durant's bald head and stuff like that. I'm like, damn, we're reaching it.
Yeah, well, happy early birthday too, brother.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm happy we got to chat about this one. If we can't have any U.S. pride in the men's national team, we can at least talk about one of the big American socialists, Hal Draper, and the essay we're doing today is The Two Souls of Socialism. We did an earlier Draper that is public now, and we released for patrons a little while ago. So if you want more of the biography, I suggest going back to that. I think we might just jump into the piece because it's pretty. It's honestly, the thing about Draper, the reason I think he's so good to do these with is he's very accessible. Like, he doesn't write with a lot of jargon. I mean, there's a lot of history and theory and stuff like that that is worth being familiar with, but I feel like he's someone you can really jump into with. But I mean, this is a pretty unified theory, at least on his part, about some of the dividing lines of socialist thought, practice, and theory that I think are like interesting because, again, like when we read the last Draper essay, it's always funny to see, oh, these fights are still happening. But I think the division he makes in the two souls of socialism, the two kind of opposing forces, is rather unique, I think, because most of the time the fight is about reform versus revolution. And he makes an argument that these don't actually get to the heart of some of the differences in socialist thought and theory.
Yeah, and this is the Two Souls of Socialism. It's a pamphlet, which is interesting. This is actually from 1966, so 8 years prior to Anatomy of the Microsect, which we did last time. I mean, and I'm looking at Draper wrote for a long time. His earliest writings on Marxist.org go back to October 1935.
Yeah.
And his latest go back to 1990. So that's quite a career.
No, sir. I mean, no, very prolific writer, and you know, some of these I think are truly classics. And I mean, like, you know, I mean, we'll get into it when we get into the text. There's some things you can disagree with. I mean, you know, just spoiler alert if you watched our one on the microsect. You know, Draper is very good at sort of criticizing some of these other sides, and then knocks down sort of totems, and doesn't, I think, always successfully erect, you know, the strongest alternative to them. But I mean, you know, criticism is important on that level. I mean, I think it's important to engage in some of these, you know, debates and sort of challenging some of these kind of popular ideas on the left. I mean, in a very broad sense too. I mean, he's including not just sort of, you know, what we would consider to be Marxist socialists, but like the socialist tradition in like the large sense. Here, and like, I'll just put this up because it's fun. The pamphlet does have a pretty cool little graphic there, the Two Souls of Socialism. You see some figures there on the below, bottom up, and then top down. And we'll get into some of those people and why he makes that argument. But I mean, should we jump in? Is there anything else we want to say introductory before?
Yeah, no, not really. I think we can kind of jump in there. I know you had a lot of notes here. I'll just start reading off the first paragraph here to kind of get us into it. Socialism's crisis today is a crisis in the meaning of socialism. For the first time in the history of the world, very likely a majority of its people label themselves socialist in one sense or another, but there has never been a time when the label was less informative. The nearest thing to a common content of the various socialisms is a negative, anti-capitalism. On the positive side, the range of conflicting and incompatible ideas that call themselves socialists is wider than the spread of ideas within the bourgeois world.
Yeah, and I think that this is, I mean, you know, is setting up his argument here is that one, like socialism as a concept, as he says, is in crisis. It's not very clear what somebody means when they consider themselves to be a socialist or they call themselves a socialist. But again, instead of it being this kind of popular argument, is like, are you a revolutionary socialist or are you a reformist socialist? He makes the argument that the real crux of the differences here is between what he calls top-down socialism versus bottom-up socialism. And, you know, he argues that these are very, very different things. And particularly, you know, he notes, as you just read, that like a lot of times what people mean by being a socialist is it's a negative definition, in the sense that you're an anti-capitalist, which is all well and good. But as we've seen, not only in like historical movements, but even from just figures that you might know on the contemporary level who consider themselves to be anti-socialist, just being anti-capitalist is not necessarily the same thing as like wanting workers' democracy. You know, there's a lot of reactionaries who wouldn't even consider themselves to be socialists who are like anti-capitalist because it got rid of the privileges and powers of the old aristocracy, right? That's like the reactionary movements of like the 1800s. So, you know, while being anti-capitalist is certainly like the first stepping stone to being a socialist, being an anti-capitalist is not necessarily being a socialist. And he argues that there's two main types of of socialism that were sort of in practice or in power at the time of writing. One, social democracy, and two, communism, in the sense of the Soviet-style communist states. And he argues that social democracy basically eliminates socialist demands, defines socialism out of existence by promising to protect private enterprise. And communism, claims to basically be socialism because it abolished the private rule of the capitalist class. But the question then is, what has been created? The state owns production, but who controls the state? It's not the workers, though it might be quote unquote communist people who do have a conviction that is anti-capitalist. He's arguing that this is very, very different from the socialism of Marx's time. And I think, this is why this piece, I think, is such an interesting one, because again, like the classic argument, I mean, you hear it particularly, like you get these kind of funhouse mirrors of these things on twitter.com. The people act like the main fight in the socialist movement is between reformist socialists, people who want to do social democracy, or radical revolutionary communists. And what Draper says is that while these two forms are very different in a lot of ways, they have a similar tendency. Social democracy is the idea of socializing capitalism from above, right? You get people in power in the state, and they socialize. They polish up the edges, the rough edges of capitalism, and by using state intervention and more social programs, that is by itself socialist. Even though one, you're still maintaining the kind of system of economic exploitation, and again, this is a kind of top-down project. This isn't something that's coming from working people taking power, but rather representatives or self-proclaimed representatives fighting for working people. And he makes the argument that communism is equally top-down. It equates a stratification with socialism. It equates the idea that because there's not a capitalist class running the system, that it is therefore a socialism. But as you see from the kind of major communist states that developed during this period of time, these are top-down states, right? These aren't states where there's a lot of entryway for everyday working people. So both of these projects, even though they have different strategies in sort of dealing with capitalism, they have different party programs, they both are kind of top-down systems. Get in control of the state apparatus, utilize that to sort of make society in the the image that you prefer. And he argues that even though, again, these are different in a lot of ways, they both have this kind of top-down socialist approach to society. I have a little bit of a quote here if we wanted to look at the opposite system, which is socialism from below, which is different from socialism from above. Socialism from below, he writes, is the heart of socialism from below is this view that socialism can be realized only through the self-emancipation of activized masses in motion, reaching out for freedom with their own hands, mobilized from below in a struggle to take charge of their own destiny as actors, not merely subjects on the stage of history. The emancipation of the working class must be conquered by the working class themselves. This is the first sentence in the rules written for the First International by Marx, and this is the first principle of his life work. And it's interesting because you see that though this is something that you can very, very clearly recognize in Marx's own writings, this is something that is strangely absent from a lot of the systems put in place after the fact, and also sometimes also misremembered as like the work of a person like a Lenin or a person like a Rosa Luxemburg. And he makes, I think, a very strong argument, for example, that these people were also trying to build that kind of system. But again, instead of it being that fight, socialism from below versus socialism from above, it's this fight between reform and revolution, which I think Draper is sort of less convinced of as the most clearly delineating factor between those two systems.
Yeah. And I mean, just right before that part, he says, the following page is proposed to investigate the meaning of socialism historically in a new way. There have always been different kinds of socialism. They've customarily been divided into reformist or revolutionary, like you said, peaceful or violent, democratic or authoritarian, etc. These divisions exist, but the underlying division is something else. Throughout the history of socialist movements and ideas, the fundamental divide is between socialism from above and socialism from below.
Mm. And like, we'll get into some of the practical reasons why this starts to matter later. I think, if time allows, I do have a short Leo Panich clip, which sort of gets us this as well. But, just a quick setting up before we start getting into this, what this piece really is going to be a history of socialist tendencies, going back to some imagined histories, to some practical histories. And if anything else, like, I think this text is a very useful one for folks to read if you're so inclined after the fact, The Two Souls of Socialism, because it's a pretty good, I think, introduction into some of the major figures. So you might hear sort of reference from time to time, sort of understanding, what their politics were and what they represent. But before we jump into that history, I just want to add one more note that I think is interesting to his argument, also interesting from like a theoretical level, is that he argues that, the top versus bottom dynamic is not something that's like unique to socialism or socialist politics. This is something that's sort of always existed in society. This idea that, it's not really that like you need to have the people taking power, but what you need is a good king. Or if the kings are messed up, then you need a good God. The good ruler is doing good things for, the good ruler does good things for the people. And like, if you study classic political theory, I mean, this is like the ancient Greeks. This is a lot of like early medieval philosophy, is like, how can we have good rulers? Which is a very different project from a kind of project of democracy and a project of, empowering the people at the bottom of society, the working people. And I think that this is, again, like something that's interesting to remember too, that it's not just a kind of like internal struggle within socialism. This is actually something that socialism imported from history and kind of political thought in general, is that you won't be able to change society if you rely on the people, because the people are too backwards. People don't understand what they want. They don't understand what they need. So you basically need an enlightened class of people on the top to be able to, to improve society. And, he argues that socialism was an attempt to actually rectify this kind of classic tension in thought and in politics. But unfortunately, it started to fall prey to that very same dynamic that has dominated so many other kind of visions of the future. And I think he also makes an argument, and I think it's something that I know you are very sympathetic to, Matt, too, is that like, one of the other problems with a lot of, the socialist movement in like the 19th and 20th century was it's sort of moving away from this idea that socialism is like an extension of democracy, right? That these things aren't sort of born together. And I think if I don't have the quote in front of me, it might come later in the piece. But he basically what
where he's talking about like tyranny is basically useful for extracting more profit. Is that I was thinking of that quote now, but it's hard to find because this is pieces in chapters and you can't control F the entire thing.
We'll get to it later. I'm sure I underlined it, but he says something along the lines of like, while like these two things like socialism and democracy are born out of similar ideas, they weren't born like conjoined at the hip, right? It was actually like it had to be a process to sort of combine these things. But I think that actually comes later, so we'll get to that when we get there. But again, like this will be a good introduction, I think, to some major figures in the socialist movement and just figures in political history. So we can dive in, if you're ready, Matt, into the first one, the some socialist ancestors.
Yeah, I mean, this is a funny section, and I always appreciated, especially like I like intellectuals commenting on other intellectuals. Yeah. It really helps you orientate yourself a little bit, and Draper really takes an axe to Kautsky here, basically, who has an overgenerous definition of who he's allowing to be socialist, including Pythagoras, Plato, and some other people who David is more familiar with than I am.
Yeah, I mean, basically, and it's a funny thing because you see this a lot too, where people will, maybe I just saw this more because, I studied philosophy at school, and like socialists will get really into this like ancient thinker and be like, this guy's a kind of proto-socialist and we should like revisit all of their things. And Kautsky, Karl Kautsky, who people knew as like the Pope of Marxism before Lenin wrote his, and most people I think now only know Kautsky in kind of opposition to Lenin because of Lenin's famous text on him, the renegade Kautsky. But Kautsky was, a very important theorist in the Marxist movement. He was called the Pope of Marxism. Lenin was very close with Kautsky for a long time. Luxemburg was very close with Kautsky for a certain time. But of course, Kautsky sort of falls prey to reformism, and we'll get there later. But Hal Draper, is sort of roasting him a little bit for his conception of like the history of socialism. Kautsky's list of socialists, Thomas More, with the observation that the two great figures inaugurating the history of socialism are More and Munzer, and that both of them follow the long line of socialists from Lycurgus and Pythagoras to Plato, the Gracchi, Catiline, and Jesus Christ.
himself. And I won't belabor this point too much, but I was saying to Matt, this might be the last time in my life I get to talk about some of these figures. So it is interesting. The first one is, of these ancestors that Kautsky sort of notes as a socialist is Lycurgus. And you can get his the history of Lycurgus from Plutarch's work. And it's this, very interesting Spartan society that has some kind of system of equality, but there's a lot of tensions within it. One, as Draper notes, this is a kind of militarist egalitarian society. And I'll read the Hal Draper thing in just a second, but just give people a little bit of flavor. The reason that Lycurgus is so interesting is because, he argues for things like, if you want to basically like hoard wealth, like you couldn't separate your silver. So like if you want to have a shitload of wealth, like you would have to carry around like a big ass block that would at a certain point become impractical to carry. And it's all these kind of like very, very fascinating, ideas for dealing with kind of like wealth concentration, difference in rank and things like that, that, have this kind of practical aspect. It's like, say the problem is that people, accumulate too much money. So let's actually make it like physically difficult for people to do that. But as Draper writes, the Spartan system was based on equal division of land under private ownership. In no way was that socialistic. The collectivist feeling one may get from a description of the Spartan regime comes from a different direction. The way of life of the Spartan ruling class itself, which was organized as a permanent, disciplined garrison in a state of siege, and to add to this terroristic regime, the terroristic regime imposed over the helots, the slaves, right? So again, he's saying that like, you're misrecognizing any kind of sense of equality or collectivization if you're reading Lycurgus as a system of like a kind of proto-socialism. Instead, what it was a very, very regimented military society. Next up is Pythagoras, who Kautsky also recognizes as a socialist, who, again, reading the piece, founded an elite order which acted as the political arm of the landed aristocracy against the plebeian democratic movement. He and his party were finally overthrown and expelled by a popular revolutionary rising. Kautsky seems to be on the wrong side of the barricades. But inside the Pythagorean order, a regime of total authoritarianism and regimentation prevailed. In spite of this, Kautsky chose to regard Pythagoras as a socialist ancestor because of the belief that the organized Pythagoreans practiced communal consumption. Even if this were true, and Kautsky found out later it was not, this would have made the Pythagorean order exactly as communistic as any monastery. Chalk up a second ancestor of totalitarianism on Kautsky's list. And again, we'll try to jump through these a little bit quicker than that, but I just want to say that like this is a very classic, strange view of socialism. If it's something like, some sense of community or community like regimentation, eating meals in common, not sort of owning your own private property, things like that, and misrecognizing that as socialism. You see this sometimes where people, talk about like any public works in society as, ipso facto socialists, right? It's like almost every kind of society throughout history has done things like build public road projects, and you can't sit here and say that like kings of old were somehow like early socialists. And I think it sometimes becomes a really dangerous thing that I think people oftentimes fall into this trap of seeing something that seems, oh, this is collective, or, oh, this is something that is trying to get rid of certain ranks and privileges, and recognizing that as socialist. The other ancestor here who is very funny is Plato. I'm sure everyone's fairly familiar with Plato's Republic. It's one of those things that I feel like most people sort of are exposed to. And Plato is one of these figures who people sometimes do attribute this kind of, socialist, yearning for, which is, equally ridiculous in my opinion. And as Draper writes, he says, the sole element of communism in Plato's ideal state is the prescription of the monastic communal consumption for the small elite of guardians who constitute the bureaucracy and army. But the surrounding social system is assumed to be private property holding, not socialistic. And here it is again. Plato's state model is government by an aristocratic elite, and his argument stresses that democracy inevitably means the deterioration and ruins of society. Plato's political aim, in fact, was the rehabilitation and the purification of the ruling aristocracy in order to fight the tide of democracy. And not going to focus on them, but it's very interesting, for example, that the LaRouche cult very much, worships Plato, right? This is top-down, society, not really about liberation for everyday people.
Well, while we're talking about sort of the contemporary resonances, there's a section here. Here in the prehistory of our subject are two kinds of figures ready-made for adoption into the pantheon of the socialist movement. There were the figures with a tinge of alleged collectivism, who were yet thorough elitists, authoritarians, and anti-democrats. And there were the figures without any collectivist about them who were associated with democratic class struggles. There is a collectivist tendency without democracy, and there is a democratic tendency without collectivism, but nothing yet which merges these two currents. And I mean, those two currents being unmerged is, I think, one of the primary frustrations of politics today. And then there's this section here where he says, not until Thomas Munzer, the leader of the revolutionary left wing of the German Reformation, do we find a suggestion of such a merger, a social movement with communistic ideas, Munzer's, which also engaged in a deep-going popular democratic struggle from below. In contrast is precisely Sir Thomas More. The gulf between these two contemporaries goes to the heart of our subject. More's utopia pictures a thoroughly regimented society, more reminiscent of 1984 than of socialist democracy, elitist through and through, even slaveholding, a typical socialism from above. It is not surprising that of these two socialist ancestors who stand at the threshold of the modern world, one more execrated the other and supported the hangman who did him and his movement to death.
Yeah. And like Munzer, I think we should definitely try to do a long show or section on Munzer in the future, because he is probably one of the more interesting, of the pre-socialist revolutionaries. I mean, his ideas on the theological level were all about, bringing the power of the word of God to the people, versus having it being relayed to you through like the Catholic Church. He had some very, very radical ideas about the power of, the aristocracy and the landed classes, and again, inspired massive revolts. So like, I definitely want to do more on that in the future, but I think, what we're getting here from Draper is that the closest we've ever gotten to anything like this in the kind of prehistory of socialism was probably Munzer, at least in the list that Kautsky puts forward. And again, you see here where if you don't come into politics with this conception of a socialism from below or socialism from above, you can sort of get fooled, right? Because you say like, oh, well, this system is, not a system of, pure private property or, kind of like capitalist way of organizing society. So therefore it must be radical and revolutionary. And as Draper shows, like, the vast majority of these systems were very reactionary. Were very much about maintaining the power for certain groups. And, particularly in the example of Plato, were set up to be anti-democratic in their nature. If you read Plato, I mean, the Republic is like a long text about why democracy will necessarily, fall apart, and why you need to have this kind of class above the people to basically be able to maintain and create a truly just society. So this tension basically between top-down movements for different kinds of society versus bottom-up ones is something that, again, as like predates socialism, but becomes very important when we're trying to build it, an alternative, because these ideas are very popular. I mean, most people have read Plato. He's still somebody you're going to read in a philosophy classroom. And people argue about how do we fight for the good. I mean, these kind of conceptions are not gone today, and they certainly were extremely powerful at the early days of the socialist movement.
Yeah, so I think if you're ready, we can move to chapter 2, the first modern socialists. And just an overview of here, Dave can go in more detail, but we have first Babeuf as the first modern socialist movement. Basically, the idea the French Revolution peters out in popular support, but you're realizing, oh, you still need these ideas. So you go to this notion of seizing power in the name of the people and have an educational dictatorship over the people. 2, you have Saint Simon and planned industrialization. He mentions Saint Simon's racist and imperialist attitudes, and also funny that he appealed to the workers after the elites failed him, which is not typical. Which is in contrast to the utopians. Well, no, it's not actually. The utopians also. Robert Owen, Charles Fourier, these guys who I think in both cases there. Appealed to philanthropists to try to launch their sort of plans for a utopian socialist society, and ultimately that's led to failure.
Yeah, I mean, I think people have like probably varying degrees of familiarity with all these moments in the history of them, and I think rather than spending too much time trying to break down all the history, I think like the theory is what's most important. So like when you're talking about this first modern socialism with Babeuf in France, right? It's this this idea that like the people have basically failed, to create an alternative. So what we need is an educational dictatorship, and this is going to come back time and time again, and actually become something that you see throughout, a lot of self-proclaimed Marxists, like different forms of this kind of conception. Which, as we'll get to later with Draper, is very different, for example, than a vanguard party, but we'll get there when we get to that section. But yeah, this educational dictatorship is aiming at creating the conditions which will make it possible democratic control in the future. In that sense, they're Democrats. This will not be a dictatorship of the people as it was in the commune, the Paris commune, let alone of the proletariat. It is frankly a dictatorship over the people, but with very good intentions. And like this is the kind of society making that we see in the top-down forms of socialism, is that the people are incapable of this. So us very excitable members and very far, people with long vision should be the ones who are in control. And I'll just read this next section here. For most of the next 50 years, the conception of the educational dictatorship over the people remains the program of the revolutionary left through the 3 Bs, Babeuf, Buonarroti to Blanqui, and with anarchist verbiage, also Bakunin. The new order will be handed down to the suffering people by the revolutionary hand. This type of socialism from above is the first and the first and most primitive form of revolutionary socialism, but there are still today admirers of Castro and Mao who think it is the last word in revolutionism. And I think the Saint Simon stuff, is just continuing this, and that might be more interesting to people who might know these histories. I think the utopians are probably the ones that are worth most like revisiting. This early system of utopian socialists, most notably Robert Owen. For these utopian socialism, what was the relationship between the socialist idea and the popular movement? The latter was the flock to be tended by the good shepherd. It must not be supposed that socialism from above necessarily implies cruelly despotic intentions. And like this is one of these things again. These kind of early socialist movements. It's not that they're saying we want to necessarily enslave the masses, but it's the masses are too stupid and incapable of sort of running these kind of systems. So we'll just, us people who are intelligent will run them. Very similar to, with a different goal in mind, but to Plato's Republic, right? The idea there's you have the philosopher kings who have to be forced to rule, right? They're reluctant. They'd rather just philosophize and hang out. They don't want to deal with the day-to-day requirements, but because of their vast intellect and, superhuman reasoning abilities, need to be forced by the people to sit on top of society because only they, actually have the capacity. And again, very, very common argument, I think, throughout not only the socialist movement, but through a lot of other kind of conceptions of politics that, it's not something that is unique. It's been a very big problem for the socialist movement. And this is where I think he has his line that socialism was born in the same time as democracy, but they were not born together. And like the big project of Marx is actually trying to fuse these things together. And then we can get to section 3, unless you had anything else to say about these early.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why section 3 is why a lot of people know about the utopians today, is because Marx came around and said, you guys fucking up. Draper writes, utopianism was elitist and anti-democratic to the core because it was utopian. That is, it looked to the prescription of a prefabricated model. Like literally Fourier was like, we need to have cities set up of 1,440 people. Like, he's like really on one. The dreaming up of, and also he's like really into lesbianism. Very interesting guy for you. The dreaming up of a plan to be willed into existence. Above all, it was inherently hostile. I mean, this sounds like I can't help the dream up of a plan to be willed into existence. I can't help but think of the Saudi Arabia like mile long
for sure.
city. Above all, it was inherently hostile to the very idea of transforming society from below by the upsetting intervention of freedom-seeking masses, even where it finally accepted recourse to the instrument of a mass movement for pressure upon the tops. In the socialist movement as it developed before Marx, nowhere did the line of the socialist idea intersect the line of democracy from below. Mm-hmm. This intersection, this synthesis, was the great contribution of Marx. In comparison, the whole content of his Capital is secondary. This is the heart of Marxism. This is the law, all the rest is commentary. The Communist Manifesto of 1848 marked the self-consciousness of the first movement, in Engels' words, whose notion was from the very beginning that the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself.
Yeah, and I think that this is like, again, one of the things that I think a lot of people miss about Marx is that, people think that Marx was like the first communist or the first socialist. No, what was unique and radical and revolutionary about Marx is that he was the one who was arguing against all these kind of other top-down tendencies, that in order to successfully build a revolution, in order to achieve the things that some of these folks, maybe from the, like, let's take people at their word, truly desire to see, it would have to come from the working class itself, taking power versus something that you could orchestrate from the top down. And I want to save, some of the things about, more modern examples of societies for then, but, this kind of like, empowering is not just like a level of not just a question on the level of like morality, right? And it certainly is a moral question, but it becomes a very practical question as you start to see in a lot of political movements. I mean, maybe because it's the anniversary of Fred Hampton's passing today. It's worth reminding folks of like one of my favorite examples of Fred Hampton, like sort of like embodying this idea. There's a video, you can see it in a Jackman video I did a long time ago called Political Theories for Everyone, where people in the movement in the Black Panther Party are giving him a proposal to build, a people's bank, right? There's something desperately needed, right? Especially for, Black people in the United States who are left out of traditional finance, or if they have access to it, it's extremely predatory and takes advantage of them. Well, Fred Hampton looks at it and he says, well, where's the political education section? And they're like, oh, we don't have that in here. He's like, well, you need it because, if people don't understand what it is that the system is, the public banking system, if they see it as just sort of like an alienated form of finance, people are going to take advantage of it. People are going to say, oh, I could steal a little bit from it. I could take a little bit of money from it. They won't recognize why it is something that is truly like their own, is community owned, and why that is such an important concept, and can undermine the entire system. So it's like there's a practical level to it too, where it's like you can't just create like the forms of alternatives without having the kind of understanding and the political education aspect there as well, or they just practically won't work. Like even if you have the authority to create them, they won't be able to maintain themselves, and they'll take even more authority in imagining that system, you would have to have a hard state or some kind of system to punish people, and people would not be stealing from the bank, not because they recognize it as like an extension of their class power, their community power, but because they don't want to be punished by the state. And like, that's just one example of something you see a lot actually in, socialist or communist societies, where like a correct kind of platform thing comes into place, but because people don't have the understanding, they're not empowered to, it becomes just an alienated form of society, just like many of the things we have under capitalist rule today. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like on that front, like there's a few things in this section. One is Draper points out that 22-year-old Marx was disappointed by by Frederick Wilhelm IV, which kind of like, I'm trying to map these onto our lives. It's like, is that the Obama moment for Marx? Basically, like, okay, this shit sucks. Then he starts goes and be a writer, but he has this. Draper mentions here, before they joined the group which became the Communist League, for which they were to write the Communist Manifesto, they stipulated that the organization be changed from the elite conspiracy of the old type to the open propaganda group, that everything conducive to superstitious authoritarianism be struck out of the rules. That's interesting because the 19th century was lousy with secret societies. I mean, the Freemasons as the famous ones, right? And these were like pretty effective at reactionary purposes. There's a famous one in Minnesota called the Knights of the Forest, who were murdering Winnebago Indians to try to harass them off of the reservation. Like, and so to like cut against that, I think is very it's very impressive to me that Marx was like going against basically the form of the time. And then they also mention, which and these things really cut against modern conceptions of Marx as a shadow conspiracy. He says, we are not among those a few months before the Communist Manifesto. And journal, they write, we are not among those communists who are out to destroy personal liberty, who wish to turn the world into one huge barrack or into a gigantic workhouse. There certainly are some communists who, with an easy conscience, refuse to countenance personal liberty and would like to shuffle it out of the world because they consider that it is a hindrance to complete harmony. But we have no desire to exchange freedom for equality. We are convinced that no social order will personal freedom be so assured as in a society based upon communal ownership. And I mean, I think that's a flex there. Mm-hmm. No, I think one, like it's very true, and I think it's very different from some of the kind of like popular conceptions of Marx. And two, like I think it's really critical, like on our own side, because there's just like really popular idea that like Marxism in itself is like an anti-capitalist philosophy and an anti-liberal philosophy, and like that misses like the dialectics of Marxist criticism of both of those systems, right? Like the point of communism and Marxist conception was not to return to some kind of primitive mode of production, some imagined past that where alienation didn't exist, but rather to take hold of the incredible capacities of production under a capitalist society, to eradicate the alienation and the exploitation, and to utilize that to create, lives of abundance and freedom for the masses, right? It was the contradiction that Marx saw in capitalism, that we have the productive capacities now to sort of escape the drudgery of human existence in all previous periods, right? Of hunger, of being unable to provide the basic necessities for society. But even with that kind of revolutionary change in production, we were actually purposefully creating hunger, purposefully creating unemployment, purposefully creating pain for people. And that rather than saying we're going to eradicate advanced production, we're going to utilize these systems. I think most people get that now, but they cling on to this idea that Marxism was like a rejection of liberalism, right? Where it was much more dialectical than that, as you've seen from some of the pieces that we've done. If you haven't, check out our series on early Marx, German ideology, on the Jewish question, etc., on Hegel's philosophy of right, where Marx takes these liberal concepts, shows how like the liberal version of them as existed in European and American society at the time was a true hollow representation of these kind of grand pronouncements, and that like socialism was actually a system that was not set up to eradicate liberalism. It was set up to eradicate the ruling class power of, you know, liberal capitalists, for example, but not like as a rejection of things like freedom of speech or of like individual rights and things like that. And he has a note here that I think is really critical, I think, for a lot of people to remember about Marx. When the leading spokesman of a liberal democracy became a socialist, he's talking about Marx. Marx's early days was somebody who was a believer in these ideas. He fought for them. When the leading spokesman of liberal democracy became a socialist, he still regarded the task as the championing of democracy, except that democracy now had a deeper meaning. Marx was the first socialist thinker and leader who came to socialism through the struggle for liberal democracy. And I think that that's a really, really critical point, is that Marx had to go through liberalism and liberal philosophy and like liberal politics to recognize how short that those conceptions came in practice and in politics. And I think a lot of times people miss that kind of history of Marx as a political thinker, that he was somebody who didn't come from the outside, but rather came through these things with the understanding, with some of these convictions to do something different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You ready to go to the anarchist thing, or you got more on Marx?
Before we get there, there's just one more thing that I think is really critical, because I think this is the crux of the argument, and we have to be explicit here to make sure that folks get it right. Because I think there's some, you know, there's a way you can listen to this argument from Draper, and you think that, yes, you know, if you go back to like the line of the end of the Communist Manifesto, working people of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains, that like there is just like this fully developed class that is ready to take power and has the capacity to do it just from the get-go. And that's a conception that Marx himself very much disagreed with. Rather that Marx saw that there was the potential there, and the point of like socialist politics was to cultivate and grow that potential. Going back to the text, like in order to change yourselves and to render yourselves fit for political dominion, this is Marx's program for the working class movement, as against both those who say the workers can take power any Sunday and those who say never. Thus, Marxism comes into being in its self-conscious struggle against the advocates of the educational dictatorship, the people who are saying, you know, we're basically going to control things, you know, to create the society, the savior dictators, the revolutionary elitists, the communist authoritarians, as well as the philanthropic do-gooders and bourgeois liberals. This was Marx's Marxism, not the caricatured monstrosity which is painted up, that labeled by both the establishment professoriate, who shudder at Marx's uncompromising spirit of revolutionary opposition to the capitalist status quo, and also by the Stalinists and neo-Stalinists who conceal the fact that Marx cut his eye and teeth by making war on their type. It was Marx who finally fettered the two ideas of socialism and democracy together, because he developed a theory which made the synthesis possible for the first time. The heart of the theory is the proposition that there is a social majority which has the interest and motivation to change their system, and the aim of socialism can be the education and mobilization of this mass majority. This is the exploited class potentialities in the broad masses, even if they seem backwards at a given time and place. Capital, after all, is nothing but the demonstration of the economic basis of this proposition. And this is, I think, you know, a critical starting point for building up the conception of socialism from below, because it's not just saying that it's already here, right? That like there isn't development that will be needed to transfer a working class who don't consider themselves in many cases to be working class, right? They consider themselves to be, you know, Texans or, you know, Cowboys fans, or I know these are all examples for me, but, you know, like, you know, all these other identities, and like the project of socialism and Marxism is one building that kind of class consciousness, and then building the capacities to actually take power and to rule. So it's not just this kind of like blind faith that is just going to happen, right? which has these kind of bad tendencies in practice, unfortunately. But it's also not this kind of elitist view that like the people are too backwards to ever take power. The people are undeveloped and will always be that way. Rather, it's a recognition that through struggle, through politics, through fighting for these things, those capacities can be developed. And if we could, sorry to go on a tirade about this, but I think this is like the crucial point. This is a point that Draper makes, and I think this is also a point that Panish makes as well, I think very well, that I think is really critical, at least to understand where I'm coming from my perspective. I'm building like revolutionary potential and change, and contrasting that to like the horrors of Stalinism, to the kind of adventurism of some of the popular anarchist movements. So I might just play a couple minutes of this, Matt, if that's all right with you. This is Panish giving a talk on this.
The problem doesn't fundamentally lie in the inadequacies of this or that theorist. The problem lies in the difficulty of organizing ordinary working people who, in the nature of the capitalist system, are denied the capacity to rule their lives, denied the capacity to develop the skills, the confidence, the knowledge to change the world. I'm entirely in favor of turning the banks into public utilities, of having common ownership of the means of production. But if we're honest, and you discovered this in Yugoslavia because you went further along this road than anybody, the notion that ordinary people know what to do with financial derivatives, which is what today's financial system is based on, well, of course they don't know. Bankers themselves don't understand the derivative process. So to imagine what we're talking about as a transformation involves developing the types of organization which are concerned to develop the capacities of their members to run democratically a world, to democratically engage in the process of transforming the world. And why is that so hard to do? Why wasn't it done is the big question. After the 1848 uprisings, during which Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, Marx had some very sober reflections. He had seen very clearly, and put it in the manifesto, that he says the first task of all working class political parties is to organize the proletariat into a class. There's no illusion there that workers are born with revolution in their genes, whether they're blue genes or their DNA. That the proletariat is not even a class in itself. Right? This is already too mechanical a notion. People don't automatically think of themselves as workers, let alone for themselves. They think of themselves as women, as Slovenians, as Catholics, as football enthusiasts, even if they're workers. So the first task is to be involved in getting people to identify in class terms, seeing that they can engage in a political relationship with one another that is solidaristic, and one that is conflictual with those who are employing them, exploiting them, making decisions for them, etc.
And like, this is the point here, because unfortunately, the answers aren't easy, and we'll find out when we get to the end of the Draper thing. But it's not this naive conception that it's just going to happen. But it's also not this rejection of that potential, and that's sort of like the crux of the difficult position that the socialist movement, and particularly the socialism from below, finds itself
in, but it's much better than, you know, the people who think that a certain event is going to create that consciousness, something that, like, it is not going to be a conscious project, but just sort of a mechanical one that just happens. I mean, history has shown that that's just not true. That's just not going to happen.
Yeah, that's why I can't stand when people are like, it's just got to get bad enough and then people will do it. Like, no, it's not.
And
it'd be nice.
And on another level, like, you look at, you know, where the Soviet Revolution started and where it ended. You know, Panich, you know, says, like, you know, there was a conscious project in the Soviet Union to depoliticize the proletariat. Particularly like through Stalinism, something that was very different from like the early days of the Soviet Union, where you saw a lot of self-organization, you saw a lot of those capacities being developed. But once the state system came in and sort of hardened on top of society, says, all right, we have this, we're going to defend it, we're not going to cede any ground. You saw conscious projects of taking people out of the political process, so they became alienated to even the systems that could seem very radical and revolutionary. And I think this is just a very important concept to understand, this idea of socialism from below versus socialism at the top. It's not, you know, this naive kind of mechanical view that, you know, all we need to do is just have this big eruption of, you know, revolutionary activity and then boom, we're living in a different world. Nor is it this kind of idea that, well, what we need is just, you know, smart people on top to sort of force everyone. I mean, what's the line? From Rousseau, you know, right? You have to force people to be free, right? It's at its heart a rejection of that kind of conception of politics. And again, it's like, this was the life work of Marx that I think sometimes people have missed. One, through outright purposeful misrepresentation by critics of Marx, by some of the adherents of Marx, but also from a lack of like really engaging with like the work of Marx and Marxism by a lot of folks. But we'll have more time to get into some of those modern examples in a little bit. We can keep going through this history of these ideas if you're ready to bring us to the anarchist, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, the anarchism one, it goes into how Proudhon is sort of just objectionable on a number of fronts, and Bakunin as well. And goes into this section. Anarchism is not concerned with the creation of democratic control from below, but only with the destruction of, quote, authority over the individual, including the authority of the most extremely democratic regulation of society that it is possible to imagine. This has been made clear by authoritative anarchist expositors time and time again. For example, by George Woodcock, quote, even if democracy were possible, the anarchists would still not support it. Anarchists do not advocate political freedom. What they advocate is freedom from politics. Anarchism is on principle fiercely anti-democratic, since an ideally democratic authority is still an authority. And I mean, I don't know what much more there is to say about that, but that's always been my sort of problem with anarchism is basically this sort of, he mentions like a Dostoevsky character, I think, that becomes a tyrant through, personal freedom. And it's just like, yeah, that's where it's at. And it helps that Proudhon is so objectionable as an individual to make that point.
Yeah, I mean, but like, let me just put Proudhon's own words out there. The principle of liberty is that of the Abbey of Thelem. Do what you want. And the principle meant any man who cannot do what he wants and anything he wants has the right to revolt, even against the government, even if the government were everybody else. The only man who can enjoy this liberty is a despot. This is the sense of the brilliant insight by Dostoevsky's Shiglev. Starting from unlimited freedom, I arrive at unlimited despotism. Right. And these are this kind of like early roots of, a lot of the popular anarchist movements in Europe. And I don't feel necessarily like we need to get into the big anarchist thing, because I know that always gets folks worked up, so we can just skip it. Like, these are the figures, this is what they said, this is that tradition. You can reject it and say there's been more development since then, but this is going through the early history of the socialist movement. I'll just end with the last paragraph of Draper's piece here. The great problem of our age is the achievement of democratic control from below over the vast powers of modern social authority. Anarchism, which is the freest of all with verbiage about something from below, rejects this goal. It is the other side of the coin of bureaucratic despotism, with all its values turned inside out.
not the cure or the alternative.
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to get to everyone's favorite boy, Lassalle?
Yeah, Lassalle here. Draper gets into sort of the Marxist myth of the German SDP, and it says the state, Lassalle told the workers, is something that will achieve for each one of us what none of us could achieve for himself. Marx taught the exact opposite, that the working class had to achieve its emancipation itself and to abolish the existing state in the course. E. Bernstein was quite right in saying Lassalle made a veritable cult out of the state. The immemorial vestal fire of all civilization, the state, I defend with you against those modern barbarians, the liberal bourgeoisie, Lassalle told a Prussian court. And so, Lassalle eventually ended up negotiating and collaborating with Bismarck.
Yeah.
Otto von Bismarck.
And we know Marx's critique of the Gotha program. So if you want a stronger and more in-depth kind of criticism of Lassalle's ideas, you can check out. We did a long video on that. I think it was like our first or second Patreon episode. It's all for the public now, but you should still support the show. Lassalle is a prototype of the state socialist, which means one who aims to get socialism handed down by the existing state. He was not the first prominent example. But for him, the existing state was the Kaiser state under Bismarck. And you started to get this like early form of reformism with Lassalle, right? You're seeing that like, oh, well, the modern state is like operating and forcing capitalism to change. Therefore, it is a revolutionary agent in some sense. And what we need to do is to sort of hope that the guys at the top, if we can convince them with our really nice arguments, we can flip things around. Not only is this sort of wrong in the sense of like, well, we understand how the state operates with the long-term goal of maintaining the system of capitalism and private ownership. So we can see the revolution versus reform conception build its way out. But since we're focused mainly on the socialism from below versus socialism from the top, here's a longer section from Lassalle talking about the working class, and you can see the kind of views of working people that are prominent within this view. This will be enough to show how true it is that the working class feels an instinctive inclination toward a dictatorship. If it can first be rightly persuaded that the dictatorship will be exercised in its interests, and how much, despite all Republican views, rather precisely because of them, it would therefore be inclined, as I told you only recently, to look upon the crown in opposition to the egoism of bourgeois society as a natural representative of social dictatorship. If the crown, for its part, could ever make up its mind to the certainty, very improbable step of striking out a really revolutionary line and transforming itself from the monarchy of the privileged orders into a social revolutionary people's monarchy. And this was not a published letter. This was a secret letter. But it shows now that we have this sort of dug up what Lassalle's private thoughts on politics were. Marx was a very animate critic of Lassalle, if you're not familiar, and he definitely got the crux, the heart of this person's arguments and what they sort of represented, from the get-go. And, I think this gets to, one of these things that happens when you do divorce socialism or these ideas from, the question of democracy, where it's like, if you can just sort of have a little bit more intervention from the state, it doesn't matter what makes up the state as much as what the state is sort of doing when it comes to production, when it comes to wages and things like that. And you'll see some, pretty extreme examples of that in the 20th century, from the Soviet Union to the United States under FDR, that, these things, they really quash revolutionary radical potential within the working class. And all these reforms and changes don't tend to last too long, because the social base that puts them in power are people who have wealth and have power and have interest in maintaining that. So any kind of victory you're going to get from that kind of system is going to be temporary at best, and at worst will serve as a very demobilizing force to trying to deal with society.
Yeah, and I think that takes us to the Fabian model here, which Draper sort of described as developing independently of Marxism as a sort of group of middle-class brain trusters that call themselves Jesuits of Socialism. I'll take for just one overview paragraph here. It was through and through managerial, technocratic, elitist, authoritarian, planist. Webb was fond of the term wire pulling almost as a synonym for politics. A Fabian publication wrote that they wished to be the Jesuits of socialism. The gospel was order and efficiency. The people who should be treated kindly were to be run only by competent experts. Class struggle, revolution, and popular turbulence were insanity. In Fabianism and the Empire, imperialism was praised and embraced. If ever the socialist movement developed its own bureaucratic collectivism, this was it. Quote, it may be thought that socialism is essentially a movement from below, a class movement, wrote a Fabian spokesman, Sidney Ball, to disabuse the reader of this idea. But now socialists, quote, approach the problem from a scientific rather than a popular view. They are middle-class theorists, he boasted, going on to explain that there is, quote, a distinct rupture between the socialism of the street and the socialism of the chair.
Yeah, I mean that's a great line, I think, to really make these things naked for folks.
It's wild at a point to be like, we're the socialists of the chair, and be like proud of that.
Yeah, put that on a banner, see how far you get. But again, like this, and again, I think going back to Draper's argument too, that this below versus from the bottom conception is not unique to socialism. You see this is a very popular tendency within liberalism today too, right? The people are too stupid. That's why we need technocratic leaders. We need the Deloitte boys to come in and fix bread prices because, the people don't really know what's in their best interest. The problem with the Fabians, of course, is that they're doing it in the names of building some form of socialism. Very, very negative in practice. And, he does argue that there's a germ of fascism within this. You see the kind of praise for the early fascist movements from a lot of these figures, a really dark period in their history. But again, it's not surprising to see these kind of developments later in history when you realize that, part of the Fabian idea was this real distrust and hatred of working people. It had some sense of like moral pain for some of the suffering that people undergo, but no real belief that these people have the capacity to rule themselves, that these people have the ability to know what's in their interest, and completely unacceptable for the Fabian model to be able to rule their own life and affairs. But again, this is something that you see throughout not just the socialist movement, but from a lot of more progressive liberal ideas too. You see it in some of these kind of more technocratic, unpopular things. Like, I mean, I wouldn't want to misrepresent these movements in their fullest and say that they're truly Fabian necessarily, but like a very Warren thing, like I've got a plan. The people don't understand their interests. People vote against their interests, kind of thing. A real hatred of the people and rejection of them, and trying to find ways to sort of get around the tricky and pesky problems of democracy. It's something that's very much a part of that tradition.
Yep. So I think next we can move to 7, the revisionist.
Do we want to give a quick shout out to William Morris?
So William Morris is the sort of good version, I think. At least a more from below version. He goes into let's see, let me find some quotes from Morris, unless you got one you want to.
I have it, the paragraph right here. It says, if we look back at the decades just before the turn of the century that launched Fabianism on the world, another figure looms, the antithesis of Webbian, Fabian philosophy, the leading personality of revolutionary socialism in that period, the poet and artist William Morris, who became a socialist and a Marxist in his late 40s. Morris's writings on socialism breathe from every pore the spirit of socialism from below, just as every line of Webb's is the opposite. This is perhaps clearest in his sweeping attacks on Fabianism for the right reasons. His dislike of the Marxism of that British edition of Lassalle, the dictatorial H.M. Hyndman, his denunciation of state socialism, and his repugnance at the bureaucratic collectivist utopias of Bellamy's Looking Backward. The last moved him to remark, if they brigaded me into a regiment of workers, I just lie on my back and kick.
Yeah, that's funny that he reacted so negatively. We've mentioned Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward a Well, and that was this one that basically it's promised you all of these like futuristic life of comfort. Like you can pull opera tube out of the wall and listen to opera, and you can walk down the streets in a sort of automated awning will protect you from the rain. And it's basically the world we'd be living in if you fell asleep and woke up Rip Van Winkle style 100 years from now. But the problem was the politics of it it's just like, this is going to happen because, the experts are going to give it to us, basically. And yeah, William Morris, very against that. Here's a quote. He warned that the individual man cannot shuffle off the business of life onto the shoulders of an abstraction called the state, but must deal with it in conscious association with each other. Variety of life is as much an aim of true communism as equality of condition, and nothing but a union of these two will bring about real freedom. So yeah, William Morris is awesome. Also, very involved in sort of the crafts movement. And if you search William Morris wallpaper, he had these sort of like intricate designs that he basically wanted to be allowed to be mass produced so everyone can have like really beautiful homes. And I think if I could, the problem is nowadays it's very expensive, ironically enough. So I don't have William Morris wallpaper.
No, that's a good shout out to some alternatives, because we've mainly been focusing, other than Marx, on the negatives of that history. But I think if you're ready, we can jump to the revisionist facade.
And he does sort of pair. This one will have Edward Bernstein as the negative and Rosa Luxemburg as the positive. I mean, one sort of overview paragraph here, just to get into it, is Bernstein contrasts his own vision of the road to socialism with that of Marx. Marx's is the picture of an army. It presses forward through detours over sticks and stones, finally it arrives at a great abyss. Beyond it there stands beckoning the desired goal, the state and of the future. He also, Bernstein also said Marx was sort of like anarchisty towards the state. The state of the future, which can be reached only through the sea, a red sea, as some have said. In contrast, Bernstein's vision was not red, but roseate. So the class struggle softens into harmony as a beneficent state gently changes the bourgeoisie into good bureaucrats. It didn't happen that way. When the Bernstein social democracy first shot the revolutionary left in 1919, and then reinstating the unregenerate bourgeois and the military in power helped to yield Germany into the hands of the fascists.
Yeah, and we've done a lot on like the betrayal of what happened in Germany, but before focusing on like, well, this is what they did at this moment, you can see the germs of it throughout like the philosophy, right? And the philosophy here is one, a rejection of socialism below, of building movements for the people, but rather trying to build something top down. And what Bernstein sees is that capitalist systems, in terms of the relationship with government, is changing. We're seeing collectivization. We're seeing, the growth of monopoly, and this is the grand opening for a kind of natural socialism. This comes again from, which this is a really, I think, crucial point in this piece that we haven't highlighted it enough. Was this kind of like teleological understanding of socialism as just like a natural result of certain kind of historical processes rather than a conscious project. And Marx oftentimes gets accused of thinking this way, which is ironic because it was Marx's critics, the ones who really clung on to this idea while Marx himself was rejecting it. Bernstein, was this is going back to the text, essentially like the Fabianisms. Revisionism found its socialism in the inevitable collectivization of capitalism. It saw the movement towards socialism as the sum of collectivist tendencies immanent in capitalism itself. Most of the contemporary discoveries which announce that socialism is obsolete because capitalism no longer really exists can already be found in Bernstein. It was, quote, absurd to call Weimar Germany capitalist, he declared, because of the controls exercised over the capitalists. It follows from Bernsteinism that the Nazi state was even more as anti-capitalist as advertised. ... And this is a really dangerous development, I think, in anti-capitalist movements. We see where that ends in the 20th century. This idea that capitalism itself was changing. We're entering into a new era of history. The contradictions were just sort of working themselves out, rather than being sort of collectively and purposefully directed by like a rising working class politics. You see its failure in Germany in particular. And yeah, I mean, just to put two different figures against each other. If Bernstein was the theoretician of the identification of bureaucratic collectivism with socialism, then it was his left-wing opponent in the German movement who became the leading spokesman in the Second International of a revolutionary democratic socialism from below. This was Rosa Luxemburg, who so empathetically put her faith and hope in the spontaneous struggle of a free working class that the myth makers invented for her a theory of spontaneity, which she never held, a theory in which spontaneity is counterposed to leadership. In her own movement, she fought hard against the revolutionary elitists who rediscovered the theory of educational dictatorship over the workers. It is rediscovered in every generation as the very latest thing. And had to write, without the conscious will and the conscious action of the majority of the proletariat, there can be no socialism. We will never assume governmental authority except through the clear, unambiguous will of the vast majority of the German working class. And her famous aphorism, mistakes committed by a genuinely revolutionary labor movement are much more fruitful and worthwhile historically than the infallibility of the very best central committee. Rosa Luxemburg versus Edward Bernstein. This is the German chapter of the story.
I like that. I like that Luxemburg quote. There's a similar one. I can't remember who says it, but we have it in the start of the Majority Report. I'm blanking on it, but it's in the hands of everybody rather than the conference rooms of the elite. And it's like, even if, like, why did the fucking Elon Musk or Bill Gates get the chance to be wrong so much in setting policies? We can move now to the American scene. We already mentioned Edward Bellamy as sort of this sort of socialism from above, and the sort of socialism from below figure we get is Eugene Debs. I did not know this part about Debs' history. In 1897, Debs was still at the point of asking none other than John D. Rockefeller to finance the establishment of a socialist utopian colony in a Western state. That idea was so durable. Like, I need a philanthropist, and we still see that today with like philanthropy. It's just like, we just don't have as much free real estate to go say, hey, let's start me up on a community. But like, Draper goes on and says,
wait, sorry, before you go on, I just want to say, I'm not doubting Draper, but that's when a citation may be needed for me, because remember, we've covered this before, the colonization thesis, right? This is the beginning of the American Social Democratic Party, its break, and the founding of the Socialist Party. Was that a lot of people, particularly like the anarchists, thought that what needed to happen was, we're going to go out to the West where there's a lot of free land, cheap land, and we're going to create communes that will eventually be able to rise to like a final conflict with like the capitalist system, just on the basis of them being better. And we've talked about why that theory was wrong. You also see that split the early American left movement. So I'm not doubting the truth of what of what Draper's saying about Debs here, but I would be curious. I would like to see exactly where it is, because from my understanding, 1897, that is when those debates were happening, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were appeals, but I'd like to see Debs's role there. But the point here, anyways, that matters little in the fact that the point that Draper is saying is that Debs breaks from this and builds up a different alternative. But just for like the historical record, I would like to know if that's the case or not, because I'm familiar with the colonization. I'm familiar with trying to get wealthy philanthropists to fund it. I'm unfamiliar with Debs being the dude behind it as well. But anyway. Right. And so Draper continues then. The heart of Debsian socialism was its appeal to and faith in the self-activity of the masses from below.
Debs' writings and speeches are impregnated with this theme. He often quoted and paraphrased Marx's first principle in his own words. The great discovery the modern slaves have made is that they themselves their freedom must achieve. This is the secret of their solidarity, the heart of their hope. His classic statement is this: too long have workers of the world waited for some Moses to lead them out of bondage. He has not come, he never will come. I will not lead you out if I could, for if you could be let out, you could be led back in again. I would have you make up your minds that there is nothing you can do for yourself, that there is nothing you cannot do for yourselves.
Yeah. And in the interest of time, I think we can ignore the previous paragraphs where Debs basically says, which is not surprising, that all these tendencies that you saw in Europe of this top-down socialism of elites, were very much a part of early like American socialist movements. Not that surprising that we mirrored what was happening in England and in Germany. But the radical point here, the interesting point here, is that Debs breaks from this. And just to keep going, Debs also echoed the words of Marx, writing Marx's writings from 1850. Debs writes, "In the struggle of the working class to free itself from wage slavery, it cannot be repeated too often that everything depends on the working class itself. The simple question is, can the workers fit themselves by education, organization, cooperation, and self-imposed discipline to take control of the productive forces and manage industry in the interest of the people and for the benefit of society?" That is all there is to it. And like this, I think, really highlights this thing that could sometimes be hard to explain to folks. This is the question of socialist politics, in my opinion. This is it. We outright reject the mechanical views of the top-down socialists. We absolutely reject the anti-worker sentiments of everyone else. The question, the challenge, what's in front of us is, how can we build this this system? How can we, do this work of education, of organizing, of building this movement? Because we've seen not only have the other attempts failed, and frankly, thank God, when you look at some of the results of some of the ones that were successful. But on our side, how do we build this? How can we do this? And it has to start from this kind of consciousness of a socialism from below. Can the workers fit themselves? Going back to Draper, can the workers fit themselves? He was under no starry-eyed illusions about the working class as it was or is, but he proposed a different goal than the elitists whose sole wisdom consists in pointing fingers at the backwardness of the people now and in teaching that this must always be so. As against the faith in the elite rule from above, Debs counterposed the directly contrary notion of the revolutionary vanguard, also minority, whose faith impels them to advocate a harder road for the majority. Going to Debs, it is the minorities who have made the history of this world. He said in his 1917 anti-war speech, for which Wilson's government jailed him, "It is the few who have had the courage to take their place at the front, who have been true enough to themselves to speak the truth that was in them, who have dared to oppose the established order of things, who have espoused the cause of the suffering, struggling poor, who have upheld without regard to personal consequences the cause of freedom and righteousness." This is Debsian socialism, evoked a tremendous response from the heart of the people. But Debs had no successor as a tribune of the revolutionary democratic socialism. After the post-war period of radicalization, the Socialist Party became pinkly respectable on the one hand, and the Communist Party became Stalinized on the other. On its side, American liberalism itself had long been undergoing a process of stratification, culminating in the New Deal illusion of the 30s. The elite vision of a dispensation from above under the aegis of savior president attracted a whole strain of liberals to whom the country gentleman in the White House was as Bismarck to Lassalle. Mm-hmm. And, this, I think, is, there's two things here, right? The first is, this is a point that I think a lot of times people fall into. The kind of derogatory term for folks is workerists, right? There's denial that there has to be a project of education, of organization, of conscious building. And is something that you see some folks reject in favor of things like spontaneity. All right, which is, we've seen that hasn't led. I mean, the last line of the Communist Manifesto is "Working people of the world unite." Then you ask yourself, 200 years later, okay, how did this not happen? Right? That's a very mechanical view of politics. It has to be something that is consciously constructed, not from the top down, but from within. And Sam Gindin, in an interview he did with Adam Proctor a couple of years back, I think had a really, really good point about this. Sometimes you see this timidness from socialists about sort of trying to push things forward, right? About saying, okay, well, the class isn't on this question yet, so we should just sort of shut up and not advocate and agitate for certain kinds of results. And he says we should absolutely reject this, like socialists as members of the working class, right? Which is different from Fabians, rich people looking down and trying to, do things with the class. Socialists are like active members of the working class. Like they're people who are committed even in times when it doesn't seem like victory is just around the corner, to like fight for this, to dedicate their time for this, to push for this. And absolutely that kind of energy and activity should be something that should be encouraged, not some kind of blind way, right? Where you're running 5-6 steps ahead of the working class. You're not rooted in it. You're not in it. But this kind of thing is like, we're just going to wait for self-actualization to occur is wrong. It is building these kind of movements is a self-conscious project. That's what Debs did, right? Debs recognized where the class was. He understood where they needed to go. And as a member of it, as someone respected in it, he fought for these kind of developments within the class. And like, it's really important to reject the top-down vision of like the Fabians, of all these other movements, but not fall into this trap of just waiting for spontaneity to arrive and like the class to self, without your activity, without your engagement with it, just organize and develop itself. Like this is a process, right? And I think Debs showed a really righteous and a very righteous and possible way of doing this. But as you see here, it's like, well, one of the things unfortunately that happens with Debs is like no one else was able to take that role. And then you have the demobilizing aspect of the Communist Party in the U.S., which very much ossified itself, and spent most of its time trying to defend aspects of the Stalinist regime. You have that ongoing. Wow. The liberals were organizing under like FDR, which was incredibly successful in the sense that we got a lot of important things, but it was so demobilizing to this this movement that we saw was happening in the early 20th century. I don't think even people who were big FDR defenders, I don't think can make the argument that this wasn't demobilizing to that, in particular the socialist movement in this country.
Yeah, I don't think you could argue it was anything other than a good whack and a missed opportunity, and for exactly these reasons. I'll just summarize this next section: 6 strains of socialism from above. We've got a taxonomy here. A lot of them are sort of self-explanatory. Philanthropism, socialism is to be handed down by the rich and powerful. We've already talked about that. Elitism, we need a sort of the educational dictatorship. It goes in on George Bernard Shaw for the Superman sort of idea. Technocrats, basically.
And elitism too is like, it's also defined by it's just non-capitalist rule, which again is like a negative definition of socialism too, right?
Right.
It's socialist because it's not capitalist anymore. Which is like, what does that mean, right?
Yeah. 3, we get planism, Elizabeth Warren, I'm not joking, but kind of. Keywords are efficiency, order, planning system, and regimentation. Socialism is reduced to social engineering by power above society. 4, communism.
I want to be sorry, Matt. I want to be clear about the planism, because like the point is not that planning is bad. He's like, the next sentence before you cut off there was like, the point is not to deny that effective socialism requires overall planning, and that efficiency and order are good things, but the reduction of socialism to planned production is an entirely different matter. Just as effective democracy requires the right to vote, but the reduction of democracy merely to the right to vote once in a while makes it a fraud.
Yeah,
So it's
I like
not a
that.
rejection of planning itself, but this idea is like, oh well, the state is doing things, therefore the state is socialist. Which you see then, but like, I mean, you see this today when people are like, oh well, look at this country, you know, a lot of like the third worldism stuff, or you know, stuff like that. It's like, well, this country has the nationalized industry, so it's therefore socialist. It's like, no, that's not. Those things aren't akin. Like, obviously, nationalizing industry, having planned production are parts of socialism, but just because there's an existence of planned economy on some level is not therefore socialism.
Yeah. 4 is, I think, the one that I think is maybe the least relevant, just communism. I mean, the United
Except for
Brotherhood
like,
pattern.
what's his name? Our boy.
It's like vibes.
I keep on forgetting his name now. Who's the weirdo who's a sword dancer who's like the big Twitter anti-Marxist?
Oh, Jimmy Concepts.
James Lindsay. Yeah. The only people who still uphold this kind of idea really is like Peterson and Lindsay in a lot of ways.
5, we have the interesting one, permeationism, form of socialism from above. Really, the Fabians, like we talked about, anxious to join the establishment rather than fight it in whatever capacity they allow it to join it, whether it's cabinet boys or cabinet ministers. Typically, the function of their movement from below is primarily to blackmail the ruling powers and to bind them off with such opportunities for permeation.
Yeah.
And then finally, we have socialism from outside. This is funny because this is the first time I've seen somebody reference Posadism, the UFO.
Yes, yeah, you're right.
Outside of Twitter. The flying saucer cult is a pathological form. Messianism is a more traditional form. Also talks about for the communists of East Europe after World War II, the new order had to be imported on Russian bayonets. For the Social Democrats in exile, liberation of their own people could finally be imagined only by the grace of foreign military victory. So that's his taxonomy.
This is 66, right? When he wrote this?
Yes. Yep.
So this is like seeing the early rumblings of what would become a very, very pessimistic and dominant, like a form of like American socialist pessimism, which is like third worldism, right? It's like the revolution is going to happen everywhere else, and then America's going to be surrounded, and and then overtaken by these other forms, and like that's how we will build socialism, right? Which is a really bad way, I think, of looking at politics. One, because it denies the working class in this country the opportunity and the capacity to build up the necessary capabilities to run the system, right? Which is exactly what socialism from below is. And 2, as you see, gets people into very weird positions where they see any kind of threat to like American hegemony as like representative of like some kind of progressive force for politics. And it's just interesting to see him sort of have his finger on what's coming, because this ends up becoming like a very popular, but in my opinion, very pessimistic philosophy that dominated the radical left in the US for a long time. And you see it still very vibrant, today, as you see people defending, the progressive nature of, the dictator Vladimir Putin,
Right.
just absolutely wild ass shit. Somebody who's like an anti-communist to their core is somehow going to usher in the period of like global revolution is delusional to me. But yeah, and again, it's top down, right? In the sense that like this is something that's imposed rather than something that's cultivated and developed.
Yep. What do you have to say about the final section? Which side are you on?
Yeah, I mean the which side are you on? Is well, let's start with the intellectuals, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because one, he criticizes something that I've at least talked about, the iron law of oligarchy, which like the iron law of oligarchy has like problems, and if people aren't familiar with it, it's just this conception is like what happened to like the social democratic parties, or even socialist movements like throughout history. It's basically that eventually people get sent into state power, their connection with the base becomes severed, and they basically they turn their backs on the people, and this is why socialist movements have so far failed in doing anything other than creating like new forms of elites. And like there's a lot of debate about this iron law of oligarchy. I think it's always worth noting that I believe the guy who wrote it ended up becoming a Nazi, but it's an interesting. I always use it because I find it to be an interesting kind of starting point to looking at, like, some of the tensions that have happened. But rather than being something that's an iron law, where I think would be the bigger problem than anything, that like it's inevitable and impossible to avoid, rather just like an interesting place to start looking at some of the problems of what happened with social democracy. But that's not even the focus of the piece. Just want to put that on the table. What he really focuses on in this section, if I have it right, Matt, is the intellectuals, right? And where this starts to become, you can see why, the top-down socialism is so popular with them, right? Because it's something that is, I mean, intellectuals, are different from capitalists. They have certain rights and privileges. Obviously, they're educated, and they're not allowed to rule. And there's always been a sense of, what about me? Goes back to Plato. I mean, fucking Plato's The Republic is all, well, I should be the king of society, basically. And it's not surprising why this is attractive to people who read books and spend their times in universities. And it's just funny to realize that, like, that kind of like very, coming from yourself understanding of politics ends up being something that's reflected in so much of political theory. But like the intellectuals have always been a part of the socialist movement in particular. But he says here, when the elitist theorist, therefore, has to abandon the posture of the scientific observer who is merely predicting that the mass of people will always continue quiescent when he is faced with the opposite reality of a revolutionary mass threatening to subvert the structure of power, he's typically not behindhand in switching over to an entirely different track, denouncing mass intervention from below as evil in itself, right? This is the things of the mob, right? The mass.
The mob, yep.
This is like Heidegger, if you're familiar with Heidegger, the Nazi philosopher. Both communism and democracy, the two pincers of the world, are turning men everywhere into mass. And he's somebody who's very much against like the philosophies that sort of recognize people, for example, as like workers, right? Because you're turning away from yourself as a being into an abstraction of something else. The fact is, the choice between socialism from above and socialism from below is for the intellectual basically a moral choice, whereas for the working masses who have no other social alternative, it is a matter of necessity. The intellectual may have the option of joining the establishment, where the worker does not. The same option holds also for labor leaders who, as they rise out of their class, likewise confront a choice that did not exist before. The pressure of conformity to the mores of the ruling class, the pressure for bourgeoisification, is stronger in proportion as personal and organizational ties with the ranks below becomes weak. It is not hard for an intellectual or bureaucratized official to convince himself that permeation of and adaptation to the existing power is a smart way to do it, when, as it happens, it also permits sharing in the prerequisites of influence and affluence. It is an ironic fact, therefore, that the iron law of oligarchy is ironclad mainly for the intellectual elements from whom it arises. As a social stratum, intellectuals have never been known to rise against established power in anything, like the way that the modern working class has done through time and time again in its relatively brief history. Functioning typically as the ideological flunkies of the established rulers of society, the brain worker sector of the non-propertied middle classes is yet at the same time moved to discontent and disgruntlement by the relationship. Like many other servants, this admirable Christian thinks, I'm a better man than my master, and if things were different, we would see who would bend the knee. More than ever in our day, when the credit of the capitalist system is disintegrating throughout the world, he easily dreams of a form of society in which he can come into his own, in which the brain and not the hands or money bags would dictate, in which he and his similars would be released from the pressure of property through the elimination of capitalism, and released from the pressure of the more numerous masses through the elimination of democracy. This is why I wanted to do this piece, Matt, because of what happened this week with the forcing of the workers to strike. And we're seeing all sorts of excuses for that decision, which I think is inexcusable. You're seeing all these kinds of rationalizations of this, right? It's the mass. The mass doesn't know what's in their best interest here. The mass shouldn't take the power to strike. It could create chaos, right? Some other folks know better. And you see this from leaders in the labor movement who he's talking about here. You see, remember, like one of the things that's going on in the backdrop right now of all of these fights that we're seeing in labor is also a rising up of the mass of workers within the union movement in the United States and saying, we don't want to be managed. We want direct elections for leadership. We want to have more power over who's representing us and how they're representing us. You see this is a real defined tension in American politics and in American society right now. I think very much obscured by the media, but if you spend time reading or listening to working people in the union movement, this is a fight that is like in the heights of conflict right now. And you see too, the role of the intellectual here, where it's like, yeah, they have a spite towards the capitalist class, but they have more options than others too. To take a nice little role here as folks in between the mass and the structure of the state. I think that this the intellectual aspect, I think, really gets into the heart of the top-down socialism from above versus socialism from below, and I think we're seeing it playing out very clearly in front of us right now. I mean. Mm-hmm. I think it's wrong when these people say like the universities are controlled by like radical like leftist communists, right? This is like nonsensical in my opinion. But there's no doubt, I think. Tell me if you think I'm wrong, Matt, that there is a tendency in that part of our society to maybe be more culturally left, to be more anti the power of like the rich. Right.
Oh, well, we know all these places are lousy with like the philanthropy and, let's get our donor base up and, help you, clear some taxes. I mean, it's definitely, conservative. The problem is like conservatism is kind of like not really useful. Even like Edmund Burke, you have to be pretty charitable to some of his arguments. But like, yeah, like, that just because it's not conservative doesn't mean it's good.
Yeah, and the point here is that if anything, the ones who are on the more radical side are more representative of this kind of top down. It's like the masses don't really understand their position. The masses don't have the capacity to understand their position. Therefore, we're going to sort of self-appoint ourselves to take that role. And this is like, I think, a very clear fight. And I think, the reason that I was so upset by the votes of, quote unquote, like democratic socialist politicians is not because the way the vote could have gone down was that the forced agreement would have been blocked. Right. Right. So then am I worked up because they're not making a symbolic vote? It's not about symbolism. It's about something very clear. The state is taking a role and saying, you don't have the right to strike. You don't have this ability. And what is the role of our movement, of the people who we have thrown up into the halls of state power? Is it to play along and to try to fight for like a nicer, more dictatorial state? Or is it to say these powers that they have should not exist? These powers that they have are against your interests. And yeah, there's no doubt about it in my head that some of these folks who voted one way were in conversation with people in the labor movement, particularly in powerful places of the labor movement, saying this is the kind of thing that we might be able to get some concessions on. I find that to not be the role of socialists is absolutely to fight for better conditions for working people, but it is certainly not to maintain the kind of managed fight that we have in this country. Yeah. And we need, to see much more and develop and support and fight for much more militancy with working class people. And like we saw a moment right there where it got brought to the head, it got brought in front of the public. This fight happened, and where was that development of that kind of consciousness from people who are quote unquote leaders of democratic socialist movement? Other than Talib, I don't think it was there. There was talk about.
No, they were obscuring it. They were obscuring it intentionally, and that's really the biggest problem, I think, is that obscuring of that principle by both the unions who gave them cover and the politicians.
Yeah,
like I'm still like, look. I'm not going to agitate against these people. I think it's good that they were in office to basically illustrate this point, because I think this is consciousness we need to be aware of. Like I think this was in some sense inevitable, and now we need to, like, I think that there are unions, other unions, talking about like, we reject this and we're actually going to look toward new ways forward. That's a much better position than if the balance of power was different and the squad could just be like, well, look at the elections have consequences, but that's the only silver lining I have to say about that.
Well, I think we're close to the end here. I want to make sure we're not missing the end of it, because you might ask yourself, okay, so we've heard about all these problems about this thing, socialism from above. We've got some historical alternatives: Debs, Marx, Rosa, Lenin. Actually, if we could just give me one moment to find this Lenin bit, because I think it's important. But I mean, while I'm pulling that up, Matt, like, the thing that is sort of disappointing about Draper here and in other essays that we've read is like very much takes down a certain perspective, but we're still sort of left with this question. And I don't mean this as a harsh criticism, because it's like that's a hard thing to, if he has the roadmap, it's that'd be a great thing. You can't expect one person to sort of come up with it, but I mean, basically what we get from him is that we have these "what side are you on" moments, and we should be asking ourselves that when we see the masses engaging in politics, when we see these kind of divisions in society, the socialist movement has to ask themselves, what side are you on? And he, goes from things happening in the United States with people fighting for civil rights against the Johnson administration. He talks about the, when they sent in the tanks into Hungary. What side are you on? That sort of is like the best guide that we get.
Yeah, I mean, not super satisfying. I gotta say. And I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think like having the examples of different figures, like Luxembourg and Debs or whoever, is maybe enough. But I mean, because it's similar to, he's got another essay released, I think, right after this one about the lesser evil voting. And everything he says about lesser evil voting is true, but he doesn't then go say we need to withhold our vote or we need to do this or that, because like it's basically just saying like the problem is an over reliance on what you think like putting LBJ in the White House, for instance, is going to do. And I think like looking back on history, like yes, particularly in terms of civil rights, like LBJ was more hospitable than Goldwater might have been. On the other hand, Vietnam and all this other shit, right? So it's and I don't know. It doesn't bother me a whole bunch that there's not it's just interesting when he says, when Cuba was invaded by Washington puppets, the question was, which side are you on? And when the Cuban trade unions are taken over by the commissars of dictatorship, the question is also, which side are you on? That's an interesting sort of like, you can come to, and you should, there are sides to take when one of like the people is even a nation state that is sort of like nominally socialistic, and then also understand that if they're within that country, if there's a struggle with trade unions, you need to be on the side of them.
It's something that our friend Bhaskar, founder Jacobin, says all the time, that like sometimes there's this kind of fantasy that being under socialism is going to sort of be the end of politics, right? Which I agree with him, and he sort of rejects. He says, once these things come under public control, I mean, there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be debated, and a lot of tensions and things like that. So, like, just like understanding that, like, this is like an ongoing process of history, and there is no, all right, well, these people are now out of history, this group is out of history, kind of conception that I think a lot of folks fall into. Like, that's a kind of theoretical mistake. But look, I mean, at the end of the day, it's like, this is the question of our time. I've probably said it 15 times in a different way. Reject the mechanical view of society, reject top-down process, and then try to do the very, very hard work of building up a revolutionary consciousness, building up a revolutionary class that has the capacity to put a lot of these things into practice. I mean, I think the way Leo Panitch says it all the time is that socialism is not a set of policies, it's a process of taking power and bringing it into the hands of working people, is a really good guidepost for a lot of these things. And maybe in conclusion, if you're okay with it, Matt, we can conclude with Draper's conclusion to this piece, which is, since the beginning of society, there's been no end of theories proving that tyranny is inevitable and that freedom in democracy is impossible. There is no more convenient ideology for a ruling class and its intellectual flunkies. There are self-fulfilling predictions, since they remain true only as long as they are taken to be true. In the last analysis, the only way of proving them false is in the struggle itself. That struggle from below has never been stopped. By the theories from above, and it has changed the world time and time again. To choose any of the old forms of socialism from above is to look back to the old world, to the old crap. To choose the road of socialism from below is to affirm the beginning of a new world.
That's awesome. I love when he put the old crap in the final line of the.
Well, actually, I not to ramble, but like, there's one last point that he makes in this last section that's worth bringing up, is that how do you build this consciousness? How do you do it? It's in struggle. It has to come from the lessons that are learned in practical struggle, and you should be finding ways to encourage that struggle to continue and to grow and cultivate. Which, going back to the strike thing, that's why I found that to be a really dark period in our movement's history, because did we push for the struggle? Did we push for those practical lessons to continue to be learned? Did we push for people to continue to realize the power that they have? I don't think that you can say that. You can say, I think it's very fair, I say it, that fight was lost before this week. The capacity wasn't there on Monday this week, and that's why it ended up happening the way that it did. Not an excuse, but it's the recognition that these are ongoing processes, and it's not going to come out of like the perfect argument or the perfect presentation or all these things. These things are important in our own personal intellectual development and the intellectual development of like groups that we're in, but at the end of the day, it's like practical struggle, practical knowledge, those kind of things have to be learned in practice, right? And I think that's sort of the answer of how to build and cultivate this thing, is it has to be through action. It can't be through theorizing. It can't be through sitting, though those things play a huge role in it.
The sitting socialists.
Yeah, we're street socialists, and I think well, everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed that. We'll definitely do more of this. This was a little bit longer than normal, but I think we got to a lot of good stuff, so it was definitely worth it. We'll be back next Tuesday with a pretty fun show. We're going to be talking about these new ballot initiative successes, some of the things that are encouraging about it, some of the limitations of that strategy, and much, much more. So thanks everyone for tuning in with us. Have a good Sunday, and see you soon.
Peace.